Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I thought it was just a harmless lesson meant to teach me humility, but with every passing day, the changes felt deeper, more personal, until I realized the real transformation wasn't temporary. It was me. I want to tell you something I have never told anyone in quite this way, not all of it. Not in this order, not with the clarity that only time and a great deal of honest reflection can give a person. I want to tell you about a summer that, for years afterward, I described to friends as strange, uncomfortable, even embarrassing. And I want to explain why, eventually, and I mean years eventually, not the clean cinematic kind of eventually, I stopped being embarrassed about it and started being genuinely grateful. Not the performative kind of gratitude you write in a journal because someone told you journaling is good for your mental health. Real gratitude. The kind that settles into your chest and stays there quietly. To tell you the whole story, I have to go back to the beginning, and the beginning is not actually the summer I was 17. The beginning is much earlier than that. The beginning is a feeling, and the feeling started when I was small. I was perhaps 7 years old the first time I understood that certain things were permitted for me and certain things were not, and that the line between permitted and not permitted was not drawn by logic or safety or kindness. It was drawn by something more invisible and more powerful than any of those things. It was drawn by expectation. By the accumulated weight of what other people, for reasons they themselves could not fully articulate, had decided was appropriate for a boy. I remember standing in the hallway of our house one afternoon after school. My mother was at work. My older sister, who was 12 at the time, had left her door slightly open, and I could see into her room, the soft lavender of her bedspread, the orderly row of shoes along her wall, the vanity mirror with its ring of warm light. I remember thinking that her room smelled like something settled and deliberate. Mine smelled like sneakers and the particular sourness of a sports bag left too long in a corner. I remember standing in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, and I remember feeling something I did not have a name for. It was not envy, exactly. It was something quieter than envy. It was something closer to curiosity, but curiosity with a small, nervous shadow attached to it. I didn't go into her room. I understood, even at 7, that I shouldn't. Not because anyone had told me specifically not to, nobody had, but because the lesson had been absorbed through something more ambient than instruction. Through the way my father's eyebrows rose when I once picked up a doll at a cousin's house. Through the way a boy in my class had been laughed at for 2 entire weeks because he had worn a scarf his grandmother made him, and the scarf was pink. Through the particular silence that fell in rooms whenever a boy or a man did something that didn't fit the invisible template. I absorbed those lessons the way children absorb language, not through formal teaching but through constant, immersive exposure. And like language, once those lessons were inside me, they became part of the structure through which I understood everything else. I want to be careful here, because I am not interested in painting my childhood as a tragedy. It wasn't. I had parents who loved me genuinely and worked hard to provide for my sister and me. I had friends. I played sports because I genuinely enjoyed playing sports, not as a performance of masculinity, and I was reasonably good at them. I laughed a lot. I was curious about the world in the specific way that children are curious, wide and indiscriminate and hopeful. But there was this thing, this persistent, unnamed thing, and it lived somewhere behind my sternum and occasionally pressed forward when I wasn't expecting it. When I was perhaps 10, I tried on a pair of my sister's shoes, just for a moment, just to see, just because she was at a friend's house and the temptation had finally outlasted my caution. They were too small. They pinched. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for approximately 45 seconds, feeling simultaneously electrified and horrified, and then I took them off and went downstairs and watched television and never thought about it again, or so I told myself. I did think about it again. I thought about it for years in that quiet, background way that things you're not supposed to think about tend to persist. I told you I was 17 the summer my parents sent me to Aunt Celeste's. I should explain who Aunt Celeste is, because she is not the kind of person you can describe in passing. Aunt Celeste was my father's aunt, his mother's younger sister, and she was, at that point in her life, somewhere in her mid-60s, though she carried herself with the kind of precision that made guessing her age feel impertinent. She had spent most of her adult life in Europe, first in Paris where she studied fashion and design, then in Milan where she worked for a decade in the industry, and then in a smaller city in the south of France where she had eventually settled into what she called her considered retirement, which seemed to involve very little retirement in the conventional sense of the word and a great deal of purposeful activity. She had come back to the country once a year, usually at Christmas, and those visits had always been an event in our household. Not because she was theatrical, she wasn't, not in the vulgar sense, but because she had a quality of attention that was unlike anyone else I had ever encountered. When Aunt Celeste looked at you, she actually looked at you. Not through you, the way busy adults often look at children, and not at a performed version of you, the way some relatives seem to only see the version of you they've decided to see. She looked at the real thing. It was uncomfortable and also, secretly, wonderful. She had never married. She had never explained why, at least not to me, and nobody in the family seemed to ask, because there was something about Aunt Celeste that made certain kinds of prying feel childish. She had friends all over the world, a small but extraordinary art collection, and opinions about almost everything that she expressed with a directness that my father found occasionally exhausting and my mother, I think, secretly admired. The reason my parents sent me to her that summer was not mysterious or dramatic. It was practical, and a little bit desperate. I had finished my junior year of high school in what my school counselor had described, with careful diplomatic language, as a concerning trajectory. My grades weren't failing. They were worse than failing in a specific way, they were mediocre in a subject I had once been genuinely good at, and excellent in subjects my parents had no context for caring about, which at the time included art history, creative writing, and the drama elective I had signed up for on a whim and then quietly loved. I had also been in one argument too many with my father about things I can only describe now as the early rumblings of trying to understand who I was, though at the time they manifested as ordinary adolescent friction, door slamming, sullen dinners, the particular brand of inarticulate fury that teenagers wear like armor when they don't yet have the language for what they're actually feeling. My mother, who was a pragmatic and perceptive woman, had suggested Aunt Celeste before anyone else. She said it with the specific casualness that very deliberate people use when they've already thought something through completely and are presenting it as spontaneous. She said it would be good for me to spend time with someone who had made a life on her own terms. My father had taken longer to agree, not because he doubted Aunt Celeste's capacity but because I think he suspected, correctly, that his aunt would not handle me in any of the ways he would have handled me. He was right about that. I arrived at Aunt Celeste's house on a Thursday in late June, carrying a duffel bag that she looked at with the expression a person gives a slightly embarrassing family heirloom, noting it, accepting it, choosing not to comment. Her house was not enormous, but it was exceptional. It was a 19th-century townhouse that she had spent years restoring and curating, and every room in it contained things that had been chosen with the kind of care most people reserve for once-in-a-lifetime decisions. The hallway smelled of something warm and faintly floral that I later identified as a combination of beeswax polish and a cedar sachet she kept in a cabinet by the door. The floors were original herringbone parquet. The walls were painted in colors that I could not have named then but that I now know were dusty rose and warm sage and the particular deep blue-gray that the French call gris ardoise, slate gray. She shook my hand when she greeted me. Not a hug. A handshake, firm and direct, which I found both startling and, in retrospect, deeply respectful. "You look tired," she said. "I had an early flight," I said. "That's not what I mean," she said. And then she showed me to my room, which was the most beautiful room I had ever slept in, with linen curtains and a reading lamp and a small writing desk beneath the window, and she said dinner was at 7 and that I should feel free to rest until then. I lay on that bed in that beautiful room and stared at the ceiling for an hour and thought about how much I already didn't understand about where I was. Dinner was extraordinary, a simple roast chicken with vegetables, a green salad with a vinaigrette that tasted like she had been making it for 40 years, which she had, and over dinner she asked me questions. Not the questions adults usually ask teenagers, which tend to be either interrogations disguised as curiosity or hollow small talk designed to signal interest without actually requiring engagement. She asked me what I was reading. She asked what I thought about a particular painter whose work she'd mentioned seeing recently. She asked me if I had ever traveled anywhere alone, and when I said no, she said that was interesting, not as a judgment but as a genuine observation, as if she was filing it away. I was guarded the way 17-year-olds are guarded, reflexively, not entirely voluntarily, and I gave short answers and probably seemed, to her experienced eye, like someone carrying something heavy in a bag they'd forgotten they were holding. Which was accurate. After dinner she said, "I want to tell you what this summer is going to look like, so you're not surprised." I braced myself for rules. For restrictions and schedules. "I don't have an agenda for you," she said, which was not what I expected. "But I do have standards for this house, and I'd like you to meet them. They're not complicated. They require attention. Mostly they require that you be present, which I understand is difficult at your age, but is nonetheless something I will ask of you." I said okay. She said, "Good. We'll start tomorrow morning with your posture." I thought she was joking. She was not joking. The next morning, after a breakfast of very good coffee and very good bread and a soft-boiled egg, Aunt Celeste stood me in the middle of her sitting room and looked at me for a long moment before she said, with the specific gentleness that the truly direct possess, "You walk like you're trying to disappear." I didn't know what to say to that. "You hunch," she said. "You fold inward. You look at the floor. It's a habit of the body, and I suspect it's also a habit of the mind. We're going to work on both." What followed was something I can only describe now as both mortifying and quietly transformative. She spent the better part of that first week, patient, unhurried, methodical, teaching me how to stand. How to walk. How to hold my shoulders. Not in a militaristic, rigid way, but in the way of someone who has spent decades understanding how the body communicates with the world before the mouth ever opens. She talked about how posture is not about performance or vanity but about the physical expression of a relationship you have with yourself. She said, "When you hold your body as if it is an inconvenience, people treat it as one. And more importantly, you treat it as one." She also, around the third day, began teaching me things about clothing that I had not anticipated learning that summer. She didn't frame it as crossdressing. She didn't frame it in any dramatic way at all. She simply had, in her home, a way of engaging with clothing and textiles and fashion that was entirely free of the gender architecture I had grown up inside. She talked about garments the way she talked about architecture or painting, as objects with history, intention, craft, and meaning. She would pull something from her extensive, beautifully organized wardrobe and talk about the construction, the fabric, the silhouette, the cultural context. And then, with that particular calm of hers, she would sometimes say, "Try this on. I want you to feel how it's made." The first time she said that, my entire nervous system fired simultaneously. I stood very still. She looked at me with that level, unruffled gaze of hers and said, "I am asking you to hold a piece of cloth against your body and notice how it's structured. I am not asking you to become someone else. I am asking you to pay attention." I tried it on. It was a jacket, a beautifully tailored women's blazer in a fine wool tweed, with a silhouette that was structured at the shoulder and nipped at the waist. It fit me imperfectly in the technical sense, and yet the moment I slid my arms into the sleeves, something in my chest did a thing I did not expect. It was not electrification, like that moment with my sister's shoes at 10. It was something more nuanced than that. It was the feeling of something fitting in a way that had nothing to do with the measurements. It was the feeling of holding a piece of the world that I had been taught was not for me, and finding that the world did not end when I touched it. I stood in front of her full-length mirror, a beautiful oval thing in a gilded frame, and I looked at myself for a long moment. The blazer was wrong for my body in certain technical ways. But the look on my face was something I had not seen on my own face in a very long time. I looked interested. I looked awake. I looked, in some way I didn't yet have language for, slightly more like myself than I usually did. "Interesting," said Aunt Celeste, and went to make tea. Over the weeks that followed, the lessons expanded in ways I could not have predicted when I arrived carrying my sad duffel bag and my various forms of poorly concealed unhappiness. She taught me about textiles, the way linen breathes, the weight of silk, the particular honesty of raw cotton. She taught me about color, about how the colors you wear either collaborate with your complexion or argue with it, and about how understanding this is not vanity but literacy, a way of reading the visual language of your own appearance. She took me to a fabric market one Saturday morning and walked me through it the way a professor walks students through an archive, touching things, explaining, asking me what I noticed and genuinely listening when I answered. She also had me, on several occasions, help her with her own wardrobe, steaming garments, folding things the precise way she preferred, organizing pieces by season. This was not busy work. She explained everything she did and why. She talked about the discipline of caring for beautiful things. She talked about what it means to be intentional, about your environment, your choices, your presentation to the world. And alongside all of this, in the long evenings after dinner when the light through her windows went gold and then amber and then the particular soft gray of a summer dusk, she talked to me. Not in the way adults talk at teenagers when they sense an opportunity to dispense wisdom. She talked with me. She asked questions and waited for answers. She told me things about her own life, about the years in Paris when she had been young and confused and brilliant and afraid, about the things she had chosen and the things she had refused to choose, about the specific courage it requires to live a life that is genuinely your own rather than a performance of what other people imagine your life should look like. One evening, somewhere around the third week, she said, "You're carrying something you haven't told me about. I'm not going to ask you what it is. But I want you to know that I've noticed, and that I don't think it's the kind of thing that benefits from being carried alone indefinitely." I didn't say anything for a moment. The room was quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something repetitive and peaceful in the garden. I said, "I don't know what it is." She said, "That's a better answer than you think it is. Not knowing what something is and admitting that you don't know is a great deal more honest than pretending you know and getting it wrong." I said, after another long pause, "I feel like I don't fit. Like there are things that belong to me, things I think and feel and notice, that don't match the person everyone expects me to be." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes. I know that feeling. And something about the absolute simplicity of that, I know that feeling, was the most comforting thing anyone had said to me in years." She didn't try to solve it that night. She didn't offer reassurances or interpretations or a program for resolving my existential confusion. She just acknowledged it, which was exactly the right thing, and something I had been waiting for longer than I had realized. The days continued. I began to look forward to the mornings, to the small rituals of the house, to the way she made even ordinary things, breakfast, a trip to the market, the folding of laundry, feel intentional and worth attending to. I began to carry myself differently. Not rigidly, not performatively, but with a new attention to the physical fact of my own existence in space. I stopped looking at the floor as much. I started noticing things I had previously walked past without seeing, the particular quality of light at different times of day, the way fabric moves, the architectural details of buildings, the way people hold themselves in crowds. And I started, very tentatively, to try things. Not because she asked me to, but because the atmosphere she had created in that house made trying things feel like a legitimate activity rather than a dangerous one. I spent an afternoon sketching, which I hadn't done since middle school. I read books from her library, not the ones I thought I should read but the ones I was actually drawn to, which included a biography of a French couturier, a collection of essays about gender and identity by an academic whose name I still keep in a notebook, and a slim, extraordinary memoir by a person who had spent their life navigating the space between what other people expected and what they actually were. I wrote in a journal for the first time in years, badly and honestly, which is the only way worth writing in a journal. And one afternoon, perhaps a month into my stay, I asked Aunt Celeste something I had been circling for weeks. I asked her, "Did you know, when you started teaching me all of this, the posture, the clothes, the fabric, did you know that it was going to become about something bigger for me than just knowing how cloth is made?" She put down the cup she was holding. She looked at me with that steady, clear gaze. She said, "I suspected you needed a door. I didn't know which room was behind it. That part was entirely yours. I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it's important." She had not set out to help me resolve questions about my identity. She had not had an agenda. She had created conditions of attention, of curiosity, of the deep respectful acceptance of things as they actually are rather than as convention insists they should be, and within those conditions, something in me had begun to breathe more freely. That is not a small thing. That is, I have come to believe, one of the most significant gifts one person can give another. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, because growth is not linear and self-discovery is not a one-directional upward climb. There was a period in the middle of that summer when things got harder before they got better, and I want to talk about that period honestly because I think it's the most important part. Around week 4 or 5, I hit a wall. Not a metaphorical wall, I mean a genuine psychological resistance that manifested as 3 consecutive days of being irritable and withdrawn and sitting in my beautiful room staring at the writing desk without writing anything. What had happened was this: I had begun to enjoy the things Aunt Celeste was teaching me. Genuinely, authentically enjoy them. The posture. The attention to clothing and aesthetics. The long conversations about art and intention and how people make lives. The particular pleasure of a well-made garment and understanding why it was well-made. And enjoying those things had started, slowly, to make me afraid. Because enjoying those things meant that I was, in some real sense, the kind of person who enjoyed those things. And the kind of person who enjoyed those things was not, as far as I had been taught, supposed to be a 17-year-old boy from a regular suburban family. The enjoyment had begun to press against the structure of who I thought I was supposed to be, and the pressure was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't simply breathe through or walk off. I had grown up in a household and a community where the line between masculine and feminine was not merely a social convention but something that functioned more like a moral category. Things on the masculine side of the line were sports, roughness, competitiveness, indifference to appearance, practicality, strength expressed loudly. Things on the feminine side, care about aesthetics, emotional expressiveness, attention to detail in domestic or social contexts, interest in fashion or fabric or beauty in any of its forms. These categories had never been explained to me as arbitrary social constructs. They had been presented, through 1,000 small daily repetitions, as natural and correct. Deviation from them had consequences, social, emotional, sometimes physical. I had watched those consequences fall on other boys throughout my childhood, and I had learned from those observations. So here I was at 17, in the house of a woman who seemed entirely unburdened by those categories, discovering that things I had been taught to avoid were things I actually cared about. And the discovery came with fear. Real, physical, sitting in your stomach fear. Not about Aunt Celeste, she was the least threatening person in the world on this subject. The fear was about what it meant. About what I would have to reckon with when summer ended. About what people would think. About what my father would think. About whether the enjoyment I felt in these rooms, this freedom to notice and learn and try things, could survive contact with the world I actually lived in. I also, and this is the part one find hardest to talk about, even now, began to be afraid about what it meant for my identity in a more fundamental sense. I had grown up in a time and a community where interest in things coded as feminine was assumed to mean something specific about your sexual orientation or your gender identity, and while I was not yet equipped to think clearly about any of those questions, the fear of having them asked, of having them assumed about me without my consent, before I had any answers, was enormous. I wasn't afraid of being gay or trans or anything else specifically. I was afraid of the loss of control that comes when other people decide they know who you are before you've had the chance to figure it out for yourself. I want to be honest about this because I think it's more common than people admit. The fear wasn't about shame in the simple sense. It was about premature definition. About having a story attached to you before you've written it yourself. About the way that one visible deviation from expectation can become, in other people's imaginations, a complete explanation of who you are and what you want and what you're for, and about how exhausting and painful it is to live inside someone else's story about you. On the 4th day of my quiet crisis, Aunt Celeste knocked on my door and said she was going for a walk and would I like to come. I said yes, because even in the depths of my sulk I was, underneath it, a person who wanted to go for a walk with Aunt Celeste. We walked through the neighborhood she knew so well, she knew the name of every flower in every garden, she knew which houses had been built in which decade and by whom. She had opinions about the urban planning decisions of the previous 40 years and expressed them with the amused authority of someone who has simply been paying attention longer than most. After about 20 minutes, without any particular transition, she said, "You've gone quiet. And not the comfortable kind." I said, "I've been thinking about something I don't know how to think about." She said, tell me what shape the thing has. You don't have to know what it is to describe its shape. That instruction, describe its shape without naming it, was one of the most practically useful things anyone has ever said to me. Because I could do that. I said, it's something like the shape of a person standing between two rooms, where the room they've come from is a place they don't entirely fit, but they know the rules. And the room in front of them is a place where they fit better, but they don't know what's in it, and they're afraid of what other people will say when they walk through the door. Aunt Celeste was quiet for a half a block. Then she said, that shape is very recognizable to me. I said, was it ever like that for you? She said, for most of my 20s, yes. I spent a considerable amount of energy managing the gap between what I was and what my family and community imagined I should be. I was a woman who was serious about work in an era when that required constant explanation. I chose not to marry in a way that most people around me believed to be sad rather than deliberate. I had interests and passions and ways of being in the world that didn't map neatly onto what was expected. And for years I spent tremendous energy managing other people's confusion about me rather than simply living. I asked, what changed? She thought for a moment. She said, I got tired. Not in a giving up way. In a clarifying way. I got tired of the maintenance required to make other people comfortable with who I was, and I decided to redirect that energy towards something more useful. Toward becoming the person I actually was, as carefully and honestly as I could. I asked, were you afraid of what people would think? She said, constantly. For years. And then less. And then almost not at all. The fear diminishes in proportion to how clearly you see yourself. When you know who you are, not perfectly, not completely, because nobody ever knows that, but when you have a reasonably honest relationship with yourself, other people's opinions become less like judgments and more like weather. Weather you can dress for. You may not be able to control it, but you can learn how to walk through it without being destroyed by it. We walked for a while in silence after that, and the silence was the comfortable kind. When we got back to the house, I sat at my writing desk for the first time in 4 days and wrote in my journal. I wrote badly and honestly. I wrote about the thing in the shape of a doorway. I wrote about the shoes at 10 and the blazer and the fabric market and the particular feeling of being in that house where things I cared about were treated as legitimate. I wrote about fear. I wrote about not knowing yet what I was, and about the possibility, which felt enormous and fragile and important, that not knowing might be okay. I want to talk, now, about something that happened in the 6th week that I have turned over in my memory many times since. Aunt Celeste had a friend who came to visit for an afternoon, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than her, named Marguerite, who was a ceramicist and had the kind of frank, earthy, unguarded quality that artists sometimes develop when they've spent enough years doing the only work they actually care about. The three of us had tea in the garden, and the conversation ranged, the way good conversations do, from one thing to another without agenda, and at some point Marguerite looked at me and said, "Your aunt tells me you've been learning about clothes this summer." I said yes, a little cautiously. She said, "That's wonderful. Men who understand clothes understand something important about how meaning is made. Most men have had that education deliberately denied them and they spend their whole lives poorer for it." I didn't say much in response, but something about that sentence, the framing of it as a deprivation rather than a transgression, as something that had been taken from men rather than something men were meant to lack, landed in me with a weight I felt for days afterward. I had spent so long thinking about my interest in aesthetics and clothing as a deviation, as something that needed to be hidden or explained or defended. The idea that it was, instead, a form of literacy, a capacity that most boys are simply never given the opportunity to develop, reframed something fundamental in how I thought about myself. That reframing mattered enormously, and I want to talk about why, because I think it matters for anyone who has ever felt that the things they care about are somehow wrong for them. The human mind, when it receives information about itself, tends to organize that information into stories. Into narratives. And the narratives available to us are largely determined by the culture we grow up in. The narratives I had available for a boy who is interested in fashion and aesthetics were not good ones. They were limited, reductive, and often unkind. They were narratives about deviance, about inadequacy, about being not enough of the right thing. What Marguerite offered, in a single offhand sentence over tea in a garden, was a different narrative. A narrative in which my interest was not a deviation from some norm but a capacity that the norm had simply failed to cultivate. That is a completely different story to be inside. I thought a great deal, in the weeks after that conversation, about how many things I had understood about myself through the wrong frame. How many aspects of who I was I had interpreted as problems to be managed rather than as parts of a self to be understood. And I thought about how much of that misinterpretation had come not from any careful reflection on my part but simply from the ambient messages of the culture I had grown up in, the accumulated, unreflective, repetitive messaging about what was appropriate and for whom. I want to be careful here, because I am not claiming that everything I understood about myself through the wrong frame was in fact the reverse of what I thought. I am not saying that every shadow has a silver lining, or that all discomfort is simply misunderstood strength. Life is more complicated than that. Some things I understood about myself through the wrong frame turned out, when I looked at them more honestly, to still be things I needed to work on. The difference was that working on something from a position of honest self-understanding is entirely different from working on something from a position of shame. Shame makes things smaller. Honesty makes things workable. By the 7th week, something had shifted in me that was not dramatic, and that's important. It was not a revelation. There was no single moment of transformation. There was instead a gradual, quiet settling, the feeling of something that had been held at an uncomfortable angle for a long time being allowed to rest in a more natural position. I was still the same person. I still had the same uncertainties, the same unresolved questions about who I was and what I wanted and what kind of life I intended to build. But I was carrying those uncertainties differently. Not as weights that proved something was wrong with me, but as honest features of a person in the middle of figuring things out. I started dressing differently in small ways that Aunt Celeste noticed and approved of without making a production of approving. I paid attention to how my clothes fit. I made choices that were mine rather than defaults. I stood differently. I walked differently. Not with performance, not with any desire to be seen doing these things, but with the specific quiet confidence that comes from making choices that actually match who you are rather than who you've been told you're supposed to be. And I continued to learn. The lessons had moved beyond posture and fabric into something that I can only describe as a philosophy of attention, the practice of noticing carefully, of taking the world seriously in its details, of bringing the same quality of care to how you present yourself in the world as you bring to anything else you consider worth doing well. Aunt Celeste had not set out to teach me this philosophy. She had simply been living it, in front of me, every day, and it was impossible to be in close proximity to a person who lives this way without some of it transferring. I want to talk, now, about what it felt like when summer ended. Because endings, in personal narratives, are often where the most important work happens, and this ending was more complicated than I had anticipated. The last week was strange and quiet. I had been there long enough that the house felt familiar in my body, the way the light moved through the rooms at different times of day, the particular sound of the parquet under my feet, the rhythm of the small rituals. I had been there long enough that leaving felt like an actual departure rather than simply the expiration of an arrangement. And I had been there long enough, and changed enough, that I was beginning to feel afraid again, not of who I was, this time, but of whether who I was could survive being transported back into the context where it had struggled to exist in the first place. I said this to Aunt Celeste on one of the last evenings. I said, "I'm afraid that when I go back, I'll become who I was before." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "That would require you to unsee things you've already seen. It's not impossible, but it requires active effort. You would have to choose, repeatedly and deliberately, not to know what you now know." I said, "People do that." She said, "Yes. But you asked if you would. I think you're asking the wrong question. You're not asking whether you'll lose yourself. You're asking whether the world you're returning to will allow you to be yourself. And those are different questions." I thought about that for a long time. I said, "What if it doesn't?" She said, "Then you make the world you're in a little wider. Not all at once. Not through confrontation for its own sake. But through insisting, quietly and consistently, on your own reality. Through continuing to see yourself clearly and refusing to accept other people's diminishments as accurate descriptions. The world gets wider in proportion to the number of people who insist on living in it honestly. And then she said something that has stayed with me in a way that very few things said to me in my life have stayed. The confidence I have tried to show you this summer is not the confidence of someone who doesn't care what others think. It is the confidence of someone who cares more about being accurate about themselves than about being approved of. Those are very different kinds of confidence. The second one is durable. The first one is just bravado. I left on a Saturday morning. She gave me a book, a collection of essays on aesthetics and philosophy that she had annotated in her small, precise handwriting over many years, and she shook my hand again, the same firm, direct shake as the greeting, and she said, "Come back next year. And bring better luggage." I laughed. I picked up my still sad duffel bag. I got in the car my father had sent. And I left. The drive to the airport was long. I sat in the back of the car with the annotated book on my lap and looked out the window and tried to hold on to everything I was bringing back with me, not as possessions, not as a list of things I'd learned, but as the actual felt sense of a person who had spent 8 weeks being treated as someone whose interior life was worth taking seriously, and who had, as a result, begun to take their own interior life more seriously. I want to skip forward now, not because what happened next was uneventful, but because telling you everything in chronological detail would obscure the larger shape of the story, and the larger shape is what I want you to understand. Coming back was hard. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The first weeks at home were disorienting in the way of all returns. The familiar environment felt strange, reasserted itself with a kind of aggressive ordinariness, reminded me through every small interaction that the world I had come back to had expectations and scripts and deeply grooved channels of behavior that did not include any of what I had been learning all summer. My bedroom felt different. My friends seemed, not worse, but different, less interested in the things I had been thinking about, which was not their fault and not a reason to think less of them, but which created a kind of distance that I had to learn to navigate. My father and I had dinner together my first night back, and he asked me how it had been, and I told him it was good, and he seemed satisfied with that, and we watched a baseball game afterward in the particular comfortable silence that my father and I shared when we were not arguing, which was a silence I appreciated more than I had before. He said, at some point during the game, "You're sitting different." He said it without emphasis, without alarm, just as an observation. I said, "I've been working on my posture." He said, "Huh?" And then there was a strikeout and we both watched it, and that was that. My mother noticed more. Mothers tend to notice more. She noticed the book. She noticed the way I unpacked carefully rather than emptying the duffel bag in a heap. She noticed that I had started asking, at dinner, what we were eating and where the ingredients came from, which was new. She asked me once, about 2 weeks after I got back, if the summer had been what I expected. I said, no. It was completely different from what I expected. She said, "Was that okay?" I said, "It was more than okay. It was what I needed, I think." She looked at me for a moment in the specific way she had of looking when she was deciding whether to ask a follow-up question. She decided not to. She said, "Good." And then she changed the subject, which was, actually, the right call. Some things don't need to be pressed at. Some things just need to be acknowledged and given room. Senior year was difficult in ways that had nothing to do with what I learned that summer and difficult in ways that had everything to do with it. The ways that had nothing to do with it, I had actual college applications to manage, friendships that were becoming more complicated as everyone started figuring out who they were going to be, the specific social pressure of a final year in a place where everyone knew everyone and the stakes of social hierarchy felt enormous and arbitrary simultaneously. The ways that had everything to do with it, I was carrying a different understanding of myself than I had been carrying the year before, and that understanding was not yet fully integrated. It existed alongside the old understandings, the old anxieties, the old habit of folding inward and looking at the floor. The new and the old were in conversation, sometimes argument, within me throughout that year. I had moments of genuine backsliding. Moments when I caught myself performing the person I had been before because performance was easier than authenticity in the specific context I was in. Moments when I said things I didn't believe in order to fit the conversation. Moments when I dressed in a way that communicated belonging rather than honesty. Those moments were not comfortable, and I noticed them in a way I had not noticed them before, which was itself a form of progress, not the progress of not backsliding, but the progress of catching yourself in the act and understanding what the act means. I also had moments of genuine breakthrough. I wrote an essay for my English class about aesthetics and personal identity that my teacher called the best piece of writing she had read from a student in several years, which was both gratifying and slightly terrifying because being seen accurately is a very different experience from being seen by accident. I started a small group at school, loosely organized, for students who were interested in design and visual art, partly because I genuinely wanted to explore those interests and partly because I wanted to create, in miniature and imperfectly, something like the conditions Aunt Celeste had created for me that summer. Conditions in which things people were not supposed to care about were treated as legitimate. It worked, imperfectly and wonderfully. The group drew students from across the social categories of our school, people who had, most of them, never had a space to take those interests seriously, and the conversations we had in those weekly meetings were among the best I had in my 4 years of high school. I called Aunt Celeste once a month for the rest of that year. Those calls were the most clarifying part of my weeks. She asked questions and listened to the answers, and occasionally offered observations that I carried around for days. She asked once, in the spring, how I was getting on with the question of the 2 rooms and the doorway. I told her that I had mostly stopped thinking about it as 2 rooms. I said that I had started to think of it more as a single large space with bad lighting in some corners, and that I was slowly learning to see in the dark. She said, "That's very good. That's exactly right." I went to university the following fall. University was different from high school in the specific way that being released into a larger world is different from everything before it, not better or worse, but more. More people, more varieties of experience, more languages for describing the interior life, more room to be imprecise and wrong and still be taken seriously. I arrived knowing something about myself that I had not known before that summer, which was that I was a person whose way of engaging with the world was primarily aesthetic and sensory and relational, that I understood things through how they felt and looked and what they suggested about human meaning-making, rather than through abstraction or systems. That knowing changed the courses I took, the people I sought out, the kind of work I ended up being drawn to. I also arrived knowing that I was still figuring out, in various ways, who I was. But I arrived understanding that this was not a failure. It was a condition. The human condition, in fact, as far as I can tell, the condition of perpetual, ongoing self-authorship, of figuring out who you are through the continuous practice of living honestly and paying attention and being willing to revise your understanding as new information arrives. Some people experience this condition as anxiety. Some experience it as adventure. I have experienced it, at different times, as both. I want to say something about the crossdressing aspect of this story, because I have been deliberately not using that word for most of this narrative, and I want to explain why and then address it directly. I haven't used the word because the word, loaded as it is with all its cultural baggage and the various ways it gets used and misused and sensationalized, doesn't accurately describe what happened that summer. What happened was not a boy trying on women's clothes for thrill or shock or secret fantasy. What happened was a person, in a safe and intelligent and carefully considered environment, being given permission to engage with an aspect of the world, the aesthetic, sensory, creative aspect, that they had been taught was off limits for people of their gender, and discovering that the permission felt clarifying rather than transgressive. The garments I tried on that summer were vehicles. They were not the destination. The destination was the experience of being in my own body with a different relationship to it, not hostile, not apologetic, not hunched inward and looking at the floor, but present and curious and awake. The destination was the experience of engaging with something I cared about without shame. The destination was the conversation with Aunt Celeste that followed, and the journal entry, and the gradual, quiet settlement of something that had been held at the wrong angle for too long. I am aware that for some people, a story like this is evidence of a particular thing about gender identity, and I want to address that with the same honesty I have tried to maintain throughout. By the time I reached my mid-20s I had enough clarity about myself to know that I am not transgender, that my relationship with my own gender, while complicated and at times uncomfortable, has ultimately resolved into something I can inhabit without distress. I am also aware that for other people, similar experiences carry different meanings, lead to different understandings, and I want to be careful not to flatten that. The experience of wearing clothing associated with a different gender is not one thing. It means different things to different people. For some people, it is the beginning of understanding something fundamental and life-defining about who they are. For some people, it is a creative practice, a form of play, a way of engaging with the full spectrum of human experience. For some people, it is a vehicle, as it was for me, for understanding something about themselves that has nothing specifically to do with gender at all and everything to do with the suppression of aspects of identity that were simply never given room. What I want to say about all of this is simply, the experience meant what it meant for me. And what it meant for me was important, and serious, and ultimately health-giving. And whatever it means for you, if you have had similar experiences, if you have stood in a hallway looking into a room you weren't supposed to enter, if you have tried on something and felt, in some way you couldn't quite name, more like yourself than you usually did, I think it's worth taking seriously. Not dramatically. Not with immediate need for definition or explanation. But with the honesty and patience that all real self-knowledge requires. I want to go back, one more time, to something Aunt Celeste said in that summer, because I think it is the most important thing she said to me and I have been saving it. We were in her sitting room, late in the summer, in the long golden light of an August evening, and I had asked her about confidence. Specifically, I had asked her how you get to a place where you're genuinely confident rather than just performing confidence. She was quiet for a moment. She was often quiet before she said something important. She said, real confidence, the durable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be rebuilt every time someone says something unkind or every time you enter a room where the rules seem to be different from the rules you know. Real confidence is not the result of being told you're good enough often enough that you start to believe it. It is not the result of accumulating evidence of your own adequacy. Those things help. But they are not the foundation. I asked, what is the foundation? She said, curiosity. The willingness to take yourself seriously as a subject of inquiry rather than a problem to be solved. To be as genuinely interested in who you are as you would be interested in anything else you found genuinely interesting and important. Most people are either incurious about themselves, they accept the first story available and live inside it without questioning, or they are anxious about themselves, which is actually a form of being too interested in the wrong way. Anxiety about yourself treats yourself as a problem. Curiosity about yourself treats yourself as worth understanding. And from that difference, everything follows. I wrote that down the next morning in my journal. I have written it several times since, in several different places, because I keep needing to be reminded of it. And I will tell you that the single most consistent thing that has been true of the periods in my life when I have been well and clear and capable of doing good work and maintaining good relationships, the consistent thing is that I have managed, in those periods, to be curious about myself rather than anxious about myself. To treat myself as an interesting, ongoing, unresolved project rather than a fixed thing to be either defended or dismantled. The years since that summer have not been uncomplicated. I have had periods of real difficulty, mental health challenges that required professional help, which I received and for which I am grateful. I have had relationships that ended painfully and that asked things of me that I did not always manage gracefully. I have made choices that I have had to reckon with honestly and then revise. I have continued to learn things about myself that surprised me, some comfortable and some not. I have continued to hold on to, sometimes with both hands, the habit of honesty. About who I am, not performing it, but actually practicing it, which is harder than it sounds and never entirely finished. And I have continued to be someone who pays attention to aesthetics, to cloth and texture and the way things are made, to the visual and sensory texture of the world, to the way people present themselves and what those presentations mean. I do not try to hide this. I do not try to defend it. I simply live inside it as an aspect of who I am, which is all any of us can do with the parts of ourselves that we have honestly found to be genuinely ours. I went back to Aunt Celeste the following summer, as she had invited me to. And the summer after that. She is still alive, in her 80s now, still in that townhouse, still with opinions about urban planning and opinions about fabric and the particular quality of attention that has never wavered in all the years I have known her. I called her last winter to tell her I was putting together this story, putting together this account, these reflections, and she said, with the characteristic directness that has never diminished, try to be specific. The specific is more honest than the general. And don't make it sentimental. Sentiment is the enemy of truth. I have tried. I want to end by saying something to you directly, whoever you are, whatever has brought you to this story. I don't know your version of the hallway. I don't know what rooms you've been standing outside of, or what you've been carrying and not yet naming, or what the shape of your particular form of not fitting feels like from the inside. I don't know whether the thing you've been taught is wrong about you is genuinely something to work on or whether it is, in fact, a part of you that has simply never been given permission to exist in the light. But I think, I have come to genuinely believe, through the experience of living honestly with this question for years, that most of us carry more than one thing that has never been given permission to exist in the light. And I think that the practice of giving those things permission, carefully, honestly, with curiosity rather than anxiety, with the patience to let understanding develop gradually rather than forcing it into premature definition, is one of the most important practices available to a human being. Not because everything you discover about yourself will be comfortable. Not because the world will always make room for you. Not because confidence is the absence of fear. But because the alternative, the lifelong practice of carrying yourself at the wrong angle, of looking at the floor, of treating the most interesting parts of yourself as problems rather than as the actual subject of your one life, is a practice with very high costs, and they compound over time. Stand up straight, Aunt Celeste told me. And she did not mean rigidly. She did not mean proudly in the sense of arrogance. She meant, be present in your own body. Be present in your own life. Be present in your own becoming. Bring the same quality of attention and care to the person you are that you would bring to anything you considered worth caring about. I am still learning to do this. I will probably be learning to do this for the rest of my life. That seems right to me. That seems like exactly the kind of thing worth spending a life learning. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with me. If something in this story helped you see yourself or someone you know a little more clearly, feel free to explore more. The conversation doesn't have to end here.